Out of 100 people, 4 will get the message.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Very excited to have David and Alissa with us today. Fun panelists are better at introducing themselves than I am introducing them. So, Alissa, tell us quickly what you do and what R3 does.
Super. My name is Alissa DiCaprio. I'm head of CBDC and trade at R3, which is an enterprise blockchain software company. We build a blockchain called Corda. And I will pass it over to my next speaker.
I'm David Schwartz, Chief Technology Officer at Ripple. Ripple's a company that sells software to banks for international payments and also builds technologies on top of blockchains, but primarily the XRP ledger.
Yeah. Neat. As you know, we're here to talk about CBDCs, which sounds a lot like CBD, so I'm always a little confused with that. You can't get high off central bank currency as far as I know. But anyways, it's very topical right now. There's a couple of reports about to drop out of Washington on stablecoins and on the future of central bank currency. I think the prevailing wisdom is America's probably not going to do that for a bunch of reasons, but it looks like you do this for a living, Alissa, so what do you think? Is America going to adopt a CBDC?
Oh, it's a really interesting question, right? So I think what's interesting about this is particularly that nobody was really looking at CBDC particularly in depth until maybe 2015, 2016. And that's really accelerated largely as a function of what's happening in the private sector. So I think what the US Fed is doing now is really trying to be considerate of what is the role of a central bank, right, to maintain financial stability. What could a CBDC do? And could it achieve those things? So, I mean, honestly, I think, with what we've seen coming out of the US Fed, we see different opinions, right? We have the Fed are kind of saying, oh, this seems like a good idea. And then we have the chairman kind of saying, like, I don't know. It could just be that they issue a central bank issued stablecoin, and that would probably do all of the things that it looks like the Fed wants to do. But it's hard to say. I mean, they haven't issued the report yet.
But how would a central bank stablecoin be different from a central bank digital currency?
Well, I mean, they're two very different types of technologies, right? Central bank digital currency issued by the central bank, it's effectively a form of M0, right? So you have cash, you have reserves, you could have a central bank digital currency. A central bank issued stablecoin would be backed by an asset. So that could be money market assets, high quality liquid assets, could be fiat currency. And so they're functionally different that way. They're also different in terms of design, issuers, custodians, distributors, things like that. But it looks like that might be where they're going.
Because I think the promise of a central bank digital currency, they say, sort of for like if there was another emergency stimulus need, you could simply distribute to everyone more efficient, better technology. However, my experience, the government is not very good at technology. David, would you be comfortable giving the keys to the money system or to crypto to the government?
Yeah, I mean, they're among the most conservative institutions on the planet, more conservative than the Catholic Church. If you're the head of the Fed, like, the biggest thing is don't mess up. Don't do something. I don't think you're going to, I would be shocked if the US Federal Reserve was like a technology leader. On the other hand, like, there are things that you can do that make technological progress and improve settlement that are more conservative and safer, using the same technologies. So I think you could see those kinds of things out of the Fed. The United States has geopolitical issues with the popularity of the dollar, and if the dollar lags behind technically, that could become a factor pulling against adoption of the dollar. So I think they're going to be in kind of the position that, kind of like what happened to Sony as they watched digital music happen. Like, they're like, we have a solid position here, and we could lose it to technological innovations. And we would love to sell CDs forever, but if people want digital downloads, then we can't let Apple become, which could be China in the analogy, or any of the countries that would like to usurp the US's role. So I think you're going to see the way the US looks at CBDCs being fundamentally different from the way smaller countries would look at CBDCs.
Yeah, I mean, I don't pretend to, to understand all the complexities of geopolitics, but in the bigger picture, what I hear, one of the reasons China has done that is, of course, for sort of like surveillance and control, but also to try to break the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, because after the armed forces, the U.S. dollar is the most powerful asset this country has. Lets us borrow cheaply. Everyone uses it. My understanding is China's running around saying, "Hey, use ours instead," in part to kind of break the dollar as a reserve currency. Is that about right?
Well, but China has been having this position for years. I mean, I think that has very little to do with central bank digital currency. I think the position of using the yuan as an alternative reserve currency, they've been moving in that direction, first with Asia, now sort of globally.
No, of course, but to what David was saying, if they have a better technology, if the U.S. is still running around selling CDs and trying to pass around its technology that way, and China has got this shiny new MP3 version of money, isn't that going to be advantage to China?
Well, it's certainly part of the flame that has been lit under the Fed. Is this okay? Well, look what's already happened. Because if you look at existing CBDC implementations, right? You have the Bahamas sand dollar, and you have China's digital yuan. Bahamas important, small developing country, not necessarily competing with the U.S. there, but China, to your point, is I think really what lit the fire.
Yeah, as a technologist and like a businessman who's trying to espouse these technologies and trying to kind of not plant any particular flag in the sort of geopolitical struggle, because that's not really our place. But I think these technologies will allow countries to have more control over their own sovereignty financially, and if they want to break from sort of global financial regimes, they'll have the ability to do that. And I think there will be pushback. And I think I can speak for most of the companies in this space that say, like, we don't want to be geopolitical actors by any stretch of the imagination. Like, we want to improve settlement. We want to provide technologies that can make things better. And we're kind of watching as these bigger themes are playing out.
Yeah. And again, for the government, though, whenever the government goes out to build an app, the government can't even build an app, right? So I just don't trust them to really build digital settlement rails. However, what the U.S. is actually quite good at is relying on the private sector to do things for IT and other things like that. So, in this case, the U.S. has got some splendid private technologies. Paxos has a stable coin. There's USDC, R3 and Ripple both have those rails. So is it possible that, as the U.S. tries to upgrade from its Walkman, that it simply goes and chooses one of these to, why reinvent the wheel, in other words?
I think that's a really interesting point. I think it's very true, right? If you look at, this is going to be kind of a weird example, but if you look at shipbuilding, right? The U.S. is not particularly competitive in shipbuilding if you're talking about cruise ships or anything like that. It's very expensive. Nobody really wants to buy them from the U.S. But if you look at naval ships that are sort of high technology, top of the line, have the best equipment, the U.S. is really the only producer and is the best producer. So I think, to the extent that what we see in this space is private companies working with the public sector, which the public sector has been fairly open to this, right? I think for all central banks, not just the U.S. I think that's really where you're going to see the future, is this public-private working together. Because, to your point, you're right. The U.S. government is not great at technology, and especially central banks have never had to do this before. They're not technology companies, and they've never had to. And if they're going to issue central bank digital currencies, they're going to have some capacity to do that. And so I think it's really the private sector that's going to bring that technology and that capacity and help them with that journey.
And they're getting pulled in two directions. Like, if you think the Federal Reserve is going to build this massive technology that's going to replace Visa, that's unrealistic for a large number of reasons, including the fact that they're too conservative, but also just because you have these entrenched interests. But I think the United States also has the most to lose, possibly of any country, because the dollar has such an important geopolitical role that the United States does have a fear that they're going to get competed out. I think also another factor is just that they know payments don't work very well. I think before even blockchain technology is kind of at a fortuitous time, because I think with or without these newer technologies, the system was going to change. You saw the Fed's push for faster payments. You've seen people's push for better international payments. And you also see that international payments don't work for companies like, Amazon, Airbnb, and Uber that have to make payments out around the world. that employ hundreds of payment engineers. And if you're going to have a competitive economy, and I want to start a competitor, a small competitor to one of these companies, if I have to hire 100 payment engineers, it just doesn't make any sense. So I think they're going to get pulled in those two directions. There's sort of inherent conservatism, and they have no historical ability to deploy a technical project like that on such a large scale, and the fear of technological obsolescence threatening the U.S.'s geopolitical role. So I think that the U.S. is in a unique situation here that's very different from the situation for other countries.
Well, what would your advice be to them, David, as a technologist, someone I think who's very good at seeing not just next year, but 10 years from now? What would your if you were like the policy wizard of the whole thing, what would you tell them to do?
Well, obviously, I would tell them to adopt the technologies that my company's building, of course, Of course, they're built the best. But no, like being very realistic from the Fed's position, I think they do have to remain conservative. I think trying to do something very big and very broad with a brand new technology, much as I believe in it personally, the risks are very high. We've seen in the cryptocurrency space, spectacular failures where people have trusted brand new technologies with billions of dollars. I know I should be the one saying, no, it all works, it's all great, it's all perfectly safe. But let's be honest, you're talking about the global economy here. Like, you're talking about the possibility for things to go wrong on a spectacular scale. So I would, particularly to the Fed, which has the most to lose, I would actually advise them to move pretty slowly on this. I feel bad saying that because obviously, putting my Ripple hat on, I'd love to say they should embrace our technologies, full bore. But I do think this industry still has a lot to prove. And so I can be realistic about that.
What we're hearing out of Washington too, are sort of the rumors. You can sort of see it leaking out slowly. Obviously what I'm hearing is kind of the one he's like, hey, I know the most about this, let me do it. And he's whispering to the other agencies. But the end game, as I hear, is to try to have stable coins declared systemically important, whatever the term was. Remember, after the financial crisis of 2008, some banks and entities like AIG were designated this and subject to special regulations. And as I hear it, it's sort of the great game is to try to designate stable coins that way and then pass them to Elizabeth Warren to kind of, regulate, under sort of, very close eye. I don't know for sure that's how it's going to play out, but do you think the thesis behind that's right, that stable coins are sort of systemically such a risk that the U.S. government has to get its entire arms around it as quickly as possible and regulate them heavily to protect the rest of the markets? Do you think that thesis makes sense?
I don't think that would work. I mean, I think it makes sense, on an initial level. I think the arguments behind it are right, except I don't agree with the conclusion. I think the consequence of that would be that these technologies would be developed elsewhere. I mean, an analogy that I might use is the early days of the internet. There were legitimate concerns in the early days of the internet that, for example, a global network could allow the theft of, military and private secrets across borders, that the internet could be used to radicalize terrorists, the internet could be used for commercial sale of child pornography. All of those things have happened, and we've learned to live with them. The internet is not without cost, but I think had regulators said these things are so bad that we need to sort of regulate this aggressively and heavily, the internet would still exist today. It's just companies like Amazon and Microsoft, and Cisco, all of the benefit that the United States got from the internet. I think it's that important that regulators try to find ways to deal with their legitimate concerns. I'm not saying I'm not saying money laundering doesn't matter. I'm not saying that terrorist financing doesn't matter. But regulators have to use scalpels and not clubs. They're just going to be very careful because the innovation will not go away. The United States will not. There are enough countries that are friendly to innovation that the United States can't regulate this single-handedly. They were able to kind of get away with that with the internet because there just wasn't, because we didn't have the internet, basically. It wasn't a global effort. There wasn't this sort of international component, but there is, and you can't stuff the genie back in the bottle. And so I would urge regulators to just understand that, you have a seat at the table right now, but if you shut the faucet off, it's going to go somewhere else. So yes, I agree that there are legitimate concerns, and yes, I agree that regulators do have to do things, but I would just caution if they say, oh, this stuff is so dangerous that we're going to just regulate it aggressively, particularly using ancient regulations. One of the problems that the United States particularly has is we have a lot of regulators. We have the SEC, but we also have the CFTC, we have the OCC, we have the Justice Department, we have FinCEN, we have all of these different agencies that are just making compliance so difficult that I think we could push innovation overseas if we don't do something. Yeah, you certainly hear that in the crypto space. I do want to stick with stablecoins a moment longer, Alissa, though, too. On
this is outside my area of expertise, but this notion that if there's a run on stable coins, that could endanger the rest of the financial system. So better, regulate them and designate them as systemically important or whatever the term is. Forgive me if I'm muddling it, but does that make sense to you from an economic point of view that, in the same way, like remember with money markets, they broke the buck and the US had to go in and backstop them in the last financial crisis. If something similar happened to stable coins, is there a risk? I mean, I know Matt Levine, my favorite columnist at Bloomberg, has said, that doesn't make sense because even if there was a run on stable coins and crypto went to hell, it doesn't interlock with the rest of the financial system that much, so it's not systemically a threat to the rest of it. How do you see it from where you sit, Alissa?
Well, I mean, I think certainly right now it's not a systemic threat. I mean, the companies that are issuing are too small. You just don't see that much adoption. But I think, we all envision a world where the future is not just going to be CBDC or have no CBDC. It's going to be stablecoin CBDC. I mean, the entire payments ecosystem is changing. So I think to the extent, I'm a little skeptical that the government would completely regulate all of this out of existence. I think the government has already taken the position that they're going to work together with private sector to understand, what the implications of this technology are, and potentially create an environment where it can grow. And so I think that's going to continue to happen. So the regulation is important for that. So for example, when you're thinking about stablecoins, what are the assets that are underpinning those stablecoins? We don't really know yet what is the right mix of assets. It probably shouldn't be cryptocurrency, but aside from that, we don't know what a mix looks like. Who should be the issuers? I mean, all of these decisions, it would be helpful if there was some kind of a framework. Doesn't have to be a heavily regulated framework, but it should be a framework that everybody can work within in order to make this, both the financial system and the economic system continue to function. Because I think it could be a really important part of it.
Interesting. And shifting a bit to the role of banks, my understanding is banks don't like crypto, they don't like stable coins because they're sort of an existential threat. They could, denude their deposit base. So, I know R3 talks to a lot of banks. Where are they now? Is there a chance of like, hey, they're going to get in it? Or is their strategy more, let's just use our clout in Washington to try to just throw wrenches in the whole thing?
So I'm going to start off by saying, by maybe telling you a little story. So when I first started working at R3, this is maybe 2017. I remember having a conversation with a bunch of banks. It was, kind of an informal conversation, and we were talking about the rise of fintech. I was like, well, do you find that threatening to you? And they're like, we're the only ones that can have a banking license. Which, of course, now everybody has a banking license. Banks are certainly slow to change, but I think in the CBDC space, there are very specific benefits that could accrue to banks, reducing friction, increasing velocity. So banks are involved in this conversation, but I think that your question also gets to the heart of the fact that we don't actually know what a CBDC is going to look like. I mean, there's so many different design decisions that you need to make, and they're all going to have different impacts, right? So if you have, a direct issue from the central bank of a token to the end customer, well, that's going to disintermediate banks completely. But then the Fed is going to have to do KYC and AML. Do they want to do that? Probably not. So I think, what we're going to see is a continued role for banks. It's going to be changed. I mean, we see this in the space more generally, right? Where intermediaries, like the traditional trust intermediaries that we always had, they have to change. They have to change their activities. They have to change, their customers and the tools that they're using. So I think we are going to see a lot of change in banking. But I really don't see banks today as being reluctant to engage in this. I mean, in our CBDC working group, for example, we have plenty of banks that are involved and just trying to understand what's happening.
Yeah. David, you don't really strike me as a banker. I've interviewed a few bankers. You don't seem like one. But, given your role in financial technology, do you ever talk to technology people at banks? Or are you, is there any conversation between your crowd and the bank crowd?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that it kind of surprised me because I had a fairly naive view of banking. First of all, I thought a bank was like a thing rather than like a large number of distinct things that exist under a sort of umbrella, and there's parts of it that are technically banks and parts of it that are not, which means they can do things both that banks can do and things that banks can't do. And I think the other thing that surprised me is I kind of thought of banks as monolithic, like there's things that banks want. Like the term big banks was redundant to me, right? There are small banks. Well, of course, yes, there are small banks, right? There are the banks that are at the top of the food chain. We can all list them, and there are probably as many as fingers. I have, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Credit Suisse, JP Morgan Chase, and then there's the whole rest of the banking industry that is not happy. They're top of the food chain, and they view these big banks as their largest and most powerful competitors. I think banks would like to be able to issue stablecoins if they could square that regulatory hurdle. Now, you say, well, that endangers the position of the banks. Well, small challenger banks are not worried about endangering the positions of the big banks. That's the reason they exist, right? That's their business. I think there's nothing more dollar that you can have than the Federal Reserve owing you a dollar. If I could have the Federal Reserve owing me a dollar, that would be like the tier 1 best dollar I could have. Tier 2 would be a U.S. financial by the FDIC and regulated, by U.S. regulators. That would be the next best way to have a dollar. If you think stable coins are structurally important and you're worried about them failing, well, then you should be letting banks issue them. But I think the problem is that there's a sort of escalation in surveillance going on. I think you've all heard about the IRS proposals to increase bank surveillance, and this does seem to be a step in the other direction. And again, I would call out the internet analogy. Like, the internet made it much, much harder to control the flow of information across borders. And information is one of the most valuable things that can cross borders. Like, this was a very, very, I know I'm older than many people, but like, that was a very, very big deal. Like, the control of the flow of information across borders was just as important to governments as the control of the flow of anything else across borders. And they almost entirely lost that in favor of the internet. And I think if they're going to lose it to stable coins and cryptocurrencies, they're going to lose it no matter what they do. Like, they're not going to be able to stuff the genie back in the bottle. And so they're going to have to start looking for constructive regulatory solutions, and sooner rather than later, because other countries are going to do the same. I know I've kind of circled back to the same point, but it is an important one.
But is it possible to build this without the surveillance mechanisms in it? Like, China scares the shit out of me for a bunch of reasons, but that currency too, being able to trace every one of my transactions. And then there was a good article, I think, in the Journal the other day saying if there was a domestic Fed stablecoin, you could use it to influence policy. You want people to spend more, well, you turn down their accounts. You can cut off spending on this or that. You can regulate morality, the whole bit. I mean, is there a way to have this stuff without it turning into a privacy nightmare?
Well, again, I think this gets back to the design questions. I mean, we're so early in this journey that there is no one definition of a central bank digital currency. So you could certainly have a two-tier model, right, where you have the central bank issuing it and then the banks distributing it. They could exist on different ledgers. That makes it a little bit more difficult to trace. In fact, it might make it too difficult to trace. So there's a number of different decisions you could take, some of which are in the China direction, to your point, where you want to have full insight into every transaction that's made, which is effectively what your credit card company has today. Or you have it be more like cash, where nobody really knows if it came from you and where it went after you spent it. So it's a little bit more anonymous. Yeah, the technology doesn't drive those policy decisions. They're largely independent. You can implement the technology around various different policies as far as surveillance and openness. Really, the only constraint is if you're trying to compete with the growth of stablecoins, like, for example, Tether, and you have a significantly more restricted regime. There are people in jurisdictions that can access Tether but not your stablecoin, or there's people who just aren't willing to go through that regulatory regime. That's going to mean that you could build these things, but then they might not do anything. That people might just simply prefer to use those other technologies. And if the key thing is interoperability across jurisdictions, which I think is a big one, then trying to retain that level of control is going to mean that your stablecoin is only useful inside a single jurisdiction, and now you've sort of recreated the international payment and settlement problem. I mean, if you look at the United States, domestic payments in the United States are pretty good. Like, it's not hard for companies in the United States to pay each other dollars. It's not hard for consumers to pay businesses dollars. Sure, there's things that could be done better, but generally, like, domestic payments work pretty well, and if that's all you're fixing, then you're fixing something that's not all that broken, right? It's international payments that's broken. It's when Uber wants to pay a driver in the Philippines, $1.50 so that he can buy milk that day, right? That's where the problem is. So if you're applying solutions where the problem isn't, then you're not going to displace the alternative solutions.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you're saying too about not being able to stop it. And I think you're right. The history of technology shows you might not like it, but you can't stuff it back in the bottle. And the U.S. I think it was 1998, did something very prescient. They passed laws to actually facilitate it and, kind of get the best of the internet while shielding some of the worst of it. And it's actually worked very well because that we have Silicon Valley. And for all the, negative things in Silicon Valley, the Facebook garbage and the rest of it, I think everyone's glad those companies are in America, not overseas. Do you think it's possible to design a regime that would kind of replicate that, but for money, have the openness of blockchain and crypto and let the U.S. Reap most of the benefits of that, or is there a country out there that's doing it right, that's ahead of the U.S. and is designing the sort of the system to nudge the technology in the best direction?
I think it's too early to say who's ahead, but there's definitely the opportunity to grab that role. And I think, like I said before, the United States has the most to lose.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think the most important thing we need to remember is that, as technologists, we know how to build a technology. We can do it to do anything. But when it has monetary implications, when it has implications for the stability of the entire global system, I mean, we don't want to disrupt that. So I think, all of these conversations need to happen at the same time, and with all of the stakeholders involved. So it can't be just made by the government. It can't just be made by the private sector. I mean, this all has to happen together.
Interesting. Just want to pivot a bit because Visa did something really interesting. They announced this week, David, we talked about before, about launching this sort of hub where it's, everyone's going to be able to plug into it. It's going to be like a universal wallet for approved CBDCs and stable coins. However, written to the Ethereum chain. It's right now, I think, just a protocol they're throwing out there. They haven't built it yet, but to me, it seems like a good idea to facilitate international transfers. But David, you had some skepticism about that.
Well, for one thing, it's only going to work in compatible jurisdictions, which is not so much where the problem is. I think the bigger problem is in jurisdictions where you're not going to be able to create one entity that's going to span all of those jurisdictions. What's going to happen is it's going to pull the jurisdiction of the hub everywhere. And I think there are a lot of countries who would balk at, let's be realistic, it's going to be the United States or the EU that's basically going to be running this system. It's going to be the regulatory hub of the system that's going to have veto power. And I think there are a lot of countries that would not be interested in a system like that. That doesn't mean it couldn't be successful in a set of compatible jurisdictions. And obviously, like improving settlement between the US, the EU, and a number of compatible jurisdictions would be a pretty big deal. But I think that would push all of the smaller countries into building their own systems, and then they'll have their own sort of interoperability. But also, I think it solves a non-problem, because if you have central banks in compatible jurisdictions, they're fundamentally trusting each other with their own currencies anyway. In other words, if you're using the dollar, you're fundamentally trusting the Fed. You can't say, I want to use the dollar, but I don't trust the Fed. Like that's a completely there is no way you can use a dollar without trusting the Fed. And so what's the problem that they're solving? Like all the people in the system who are using dollars trust the Fed. All the people in the system who are using euros trust the ECB. So what do you need a middleman between the Fed and the ECB for? What does the middleman do? Is it another party that I just have to try? Like you can leverage the existing trust without the other party serves no purpose. There's no reason to make a trustless exchange between people who trust the Federal Reserve and people who trust the ECB if the Federal Reserve and the ECB have to cooperate for the system to work anyway. So I don't know what they're solving.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And this might be a sort of a silly question, but I'm in over my head on the technological part of it. You're not. What about like if you built such a hub? And I agree, some people wouldn't participate, but would one risk be like backdoors? Whenever there's a network, be it Huawei or the stuff the U.S. built, if you're the country that designs it, you can always build in a kind of a backdoor to exploit it if need be. Does that sort of concern apply to these hubs and wallets and blockchain, or is that a silly question?
You can build it either way. So you can build it so that it's provable that the hub is not doing anything it's not supposed to do. For example, the Bitcoin blockchain or the Ethereum blockchain, the XRP ledger, any blockchain is essentially such a hub, right? It connects people who want to use different everyone who wants to use Bitcoin in the world is connected by this single blockchain, and the blockchain can't betray them. It's structurally not possible. You can design a system that has specific administrative functions, but only those administrative functions can be used in the way that they are. It would be basically like you could add to Bitcoin an administrative transaction to transfer ownership of Bitcoin from one participant. It wouldn't be accepted, but if you were building a system from scratch, you could build that function in, and you would have to use that in complete transparency. Or you could build a system that was a complete closed door and nobody could see anything inside it. But I would argue sort of what's the point? Like we already have those systems. Those systems today are not solving the problem. So if you're just going to build a system that's kind of shadowy and secretive and it's going to work between jurisdictions, I don't see how that's going to work. I don't see why jurisdictions that aren't like fully aligned would use such a system. Yeah.
It's almost like you look at the history of like walled garden projects, like early AOL and stuff. Sooner or later, people just go to the open source one instead. So. Shifting again, Alissa, you spent quite a bit of time overseas. Curious to get the perspective from sort of smaller countries. We've been talking a lot about like how the US sees things, but tell me about sort of some of your experiences in other countries and how they're looking at CBDCs and blockchain.
Well, it's interesting. I think it's really been, you do see this difference in how sort of large, complex, advanced countries like the US or the countries in the EU are looking at this, where there was initial focus on wholesale CBDCs. So this is, the CBDC that would happen between institutions that already have accounts at the central bank, so largely financial institutions, banks. Whereas in developing countries, most of the conversation is focused on the inclusion element. So financial inclusion, often a big problem, a lot of unbanked, people that are banked aren't able to get finance in the ways that they need. So if you could use the central bank accounts, then that could, for the first time, move the needle on financial inclusion. So that's really where you see a lot of the conversation in the developing countries, which is pretty important, right? I mean, I've been doing work on financial inclusion for the past decade, and nothing has changed it. I mean, when we first calculated the trade finance gap in 2013, it hasn't materially changed even up to today. And in that time, you've had digitization of banks, and they were like, that will solve everything because it'll reduce costs. You can finally, open bank accounts to everybody. It didn't change things. And so then you kind of had blockchain, and that's sort of moving the needle a little bit, but it's not moving it that much. So I think, this is why a lot of these countries have kind of grabbed onto this. Maybe this is the thing that moves the needle. So I think, that's really the difference you see. Although increasingly you're also seeing advanced countries looking at the retail side as well. But I think, this financial inclusion question is incredibly important. And I think one of the really interesting things about CBDC that we're just beginning to talk about.
But do you have like a practical example of how they're going about it? Like just going back to the government's not being good at technology. Let's take, I don't know, like Cambodia or Niger or places that could use more financial inclusion. Are they sitting there, planning to spin this up themselves, or are they calling you, or are they calling, David to do it? How do you actually implement it?
I hope they will call me first.
Yeah, well, I said, yeah, I mean, so a lot of the factors are different in these smaller countries. So they have a lot less to lose and a lot more to gain. They don't have this powerful system of incumbents. They don't have the situation where anybody in their country who wants a bank account can have it, even people who, some banks will give it to you even if you don't want them. I mean, they have the complete opposite set of problems. And there it is more realistic to see them experimenting with these technologies. And so I think you're going to see a lot of the lead coming from these smaller countries. I don't think they're going to build them with their own internal technology. I think they're going to go to companies that are offering them these technological solutions, and they're going to build, in some cases, they may be regional solutions. There are certain regions, the Middle East being an obvious one, where they're not very happy with the existing sort of payment infrastructure between those countries. I think the big model here is, improving domestic settlement is something that there's a lot of ways to do, but improving international settlement is a big one because it's terrible pretty much everywhere. And so regional solutions could be big. You'll see countries that will sort of lead that sort of charge regionally. It'll be the more economically powerful, the countries that have the most to gain, the companies that benefit the most from regional trade will push those kinds of agendas, and hopefully they'll adopt the technologies that will build systems that will produce better financial inclusion. They'll bring the costs down. The two biggest things are sort of cost and security. One of the reasons why, like, the Federal Reserve wouldn't allow everybody who wanted to access wire transfer systems, because the systems are built on security models that assume that all of the people who use it have 24/7 like cybersecurity response, that they do penetration testing, and when their sort of outer border is penetrated, you see these stories about tens of millions of dollars being stolen. They need to build it on technologies that are designed from the ground up to withstand hostile attacks. If you look at every major blockchain over the past 5 years, there's been no downtime. There have been no security incidents. Like, this technology is fundamentally able to handle these sort of high values without having to have central vaults that are defended. So I'm very optimistic that you'll probably see the lead coming from the smaller countries. Like I said, unless the United States decides that it's structurally important. But given the regulatory regime here, I don't have much hope.
Very quickly, I want to touch on, because with these small countries, they could, of course, just use networks that companies have built, like Ripple's built, like R3's built. But increasingly, every company that builds a blockchain network also has a token. So I just want to ask quickly, Alissa, it's reported last week that R3 is launching a token. Is that true?
Well, we've certainly been looking at the token space. I wanted to get back at one issue that he had mentioned really quickly, which is the Cambodia example in developing countries issuing their own central bank digital currency. I worked with the Central Bank of Cambodia many years ago when they were first exploring this digital currency thing. And I remember I sat in a room, they had the entire blockchain team there, they had the IT guys on one side, and they had the business people on the other side, and the deputy governor was there. She said, we're looking at central bank digital currency, we want to learn about this. And the IT guys were like, we've already built it. They're like, retail CBDC, like, we can do it. And they were very excited about it. They said, it's 99% built, we can issue it tomorrow. And the business side, they kind of looked at me and they were like, what are they talking about? Like, can you please send us any literature? Like, we don't understand this. So I think that's a real danger as well in the developing countries moving very quickly with this. I mean, they are, to your point, working with private sector companies to build this. They're largely not building it themselves, but there is this danger of releasing something too quickly. It's a new technology. We have to be careful with it.
Neat. We only have 30 seconds left, and we have to get in the game we always play at CB Insights every year. One of the reasons I like this conference. Overrated or underrated? So I'll say three things, and you go first, David. Bitcoin, overrated or underrated?
Underrated.
Overrated.
Ooh.
Ethereum.
Overrated.
Overrated.
Oh. Gary Gensler.
I refuse to answer that question on the grounds my answer might tend to incriminate me.
I would say underrated.
Wow, okay.
He makes me nervous.
Yeah. A good piece of gossip I heard he's aiming to be Treasury Secretary. Would you like that, David?
It would get him out of the SEC. I did not say that.
Yeah. Anyone from the SEC in the room? Increasingly, these conferences, SEC people are popping up. The last one I went to, the SEC actually served a subpoena in one of the companies, which seemed a little low blow, but that's how it goes. But anyways, we're out of time. Please give a big hand to David and Alissa for a great discussion.